Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, a podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Kevin Boyle. Kevin is an author and professor of American history at the Northwestern University, and he is the author of 5 books. And today, we will speak about his latest book, The Shattering, America in the 1960s. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, of course, Kevin, you wrote about this period in history that changed practically our perception of social rights, of sex, of war or anti-war sentiments that we have right now. So I can see why you dedicated part of your life to this period of history. But before we get there, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You are a professor. I wonder what is it that drove you towards this life career, and also why history?
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you that I became a professor for some deep philosophical reason, but the truth is that I wasn't really very good at anything else. Um, it's just a job that I feel incredibly lucky to have because I've been at it for a good long time now. And the job gives me the opportunity to do two things that I really love, which is to teach students and to write. And then I get paid to do both of those things. So I think it's all a bit of luck.
And when did you discover you have this love for writing? Because most people, they say, oh, one day I will write a book, but they never do. And one of the reasons is because that requires time, dedication, and courage.
Well, I'd look again, kind of probably sounds a bit of a cliche, but I loved writing for as long as I can remember. I mean, yeah, I was writing stories in grade school. I wrote for my high school newspaper. I wrote for my college newspaper. Writing was always just the one form of creativity that I just loved doing and embraced. And then inside the historical profession, inside my discipline, books are the form of writing that we do, the main form of writing that we do. And so it seemed like an obvious thing to try to write a book. There's a big gap between, as you say, trying to write a book and actually finishing a book. But because I think I've been lucky enough to derive just this kind of joy from it, not every day, believe me, there are days where I would rather be doing anything else. It never felt like a terrible burden to me.
In the context of writing nonfiction, do you think that a person with the title of professor has an advantage to bring a book towards the market as opposed to someone who doesn't have that title?
Yeah, I do. I think it gives you a certain cachet, whether you deserve it or not, with publishers. And then there is, of course, a whole side of publishing that is in the academic world, university presses that are looking for faculty members to write. This book that and my previous one were with trade presses, so that wasn't with the academic world. But yeah, we definitely get a cachet of, kind of expertise, whether we deserve that or not.
At least the publisher knows that you have put in the time into the whatever time subject of
Yeah,
expertise, as
yeah.
opposed me declaring tomorrow that I'm a life coach because I took a 3 months course in the internet.
Yeah, and believe me, the last thing anyone would want is me to be their life coach.
Okay, well, going into your history of writing, can you tell us some of the titles of the books that you have written before this one?
Sure. So the first book I wrote was an academic book. It's called The UAW, the United Automobile Workers, and the Heyday of American Liberalism. And then I co-wrote a book with a marvelous historian who also happens to be my wife, called Muddy Boots and Ragged Aprons. It is a book of photos of working class life in Detroit, which is a subject I've returned to any number of times, in the early days of the 20th century. And then I did an edited book on organized labor and American politics. And then I wrote a book called Arc of Justice, subtitle is A Saga of Race, Civil Rights, and Murder in the Jazz Age. And that is a nonfiction book about a civil rights issue in the 1920s in Detroit again. And then this most recent book is The Shattering, which is a history of the United States in the 1960s.
So I can see you have a tendency, or you like to share the idea of labor, civil rights, and yeah, social
Yep.
equality. Okay, great.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so then how do you stumble upon this book in particular? How you came to that decision that you are going to write a book about the 60s?
So it actually started from teaching. I haven't in a few years, but I used to teach a course on the 1960s, which had a lot of student interest in it. My students were born now. Gosh, when were my students born? 2002, 2003. So the 60s is ancient history for them, but it's a period that so many fundamental things happened and so many fundamental things changed that it's a course that I really felt was important to teach. And then at a certain point, I thought, you know what I would also like to do is build on that experience of teaching that course to write a book for readers who want to learn more about the 1960s or who lived through the 1960s and want to think about their meaning now, all these decades later.
Is that something that happens in colleges to take a particular decade and decipher it and convert it into a college course like the 60s?
It's actually, that's a great question. It's not something that happens a lot. The 1960s, because it has this kind of sensibility to it, is one of those rare exceptions. So it would be really uncommon to find a course on, I don't know, the 1910s, but the 60s still draws students in because so much fundamental change occurred.
I'm wondering, is there a course anywhere you know about the 1920s? That seemed to me like another moment of history that
That,
changed
I
society.
don't. And actually, that would be a course I would love to teach, actually. You've given me a good thought here.
Perfect. Okay, well, your book covers race, militarism, sexuality. I wonder if we could start with the topic of race. What was happening at that time, North versus South, or everywhere around, civil rights, etc.?
Yeah, in many ways, it is the transformational period for civil rights in the United States. For African American civil rights in particular, is what I focus on because that's the key story. That the United States had in place this dramatically sweeping system of segregation. And it's in the 1960s that a key portion of that system was broken. The Southern form of segregation, everyone called Jim Crow. So this is a story of the breakthrough of African American activism against one hunk of that segregation system. And it's also the story of how that portions of that segregation system, particularly in cities like mine, like Chicago, where I live in suburban Chicago, didn't break the systems of segregation in those portions of America. And we live with those to this day, and to this day, they are shaping the national experience.
Wow. And in the South, I know, of course, and we all know that the Black were oppressed, but at the same time, the Southerners didn't want the Black people to migrate to the North either. So it's just like they didn't want this or the other thing.
Yeah, exactly. The migration, African American migration out of the South, for understandable a lot of reasons, but certainly to escape that racial system, had been going on for a long time by the 60s. It had been going on for almost half a century. And as that happened, then the system of segregation in the North intensified too. So, the civil rights movement confronted that system too in the 60s. And that's a big part of the story I try to tell.
And in regards to racial tension, I know that the Supreme Court had some important decisions at that time in history. Could you name one or two?
Oh, yeah, there are some really dramatic decisions. There is, of course, and this is a kind of a starting point, there is, of course, the famous Brown versus Board of Education, which is 1954. And what the court rules is that in schools, the concept of separate but equal schools is unconstitutional. And that's the basis of school segregation in the South. Another really key case comes in 1967, the Loving case, in which the Supreme Court rules against the laws that were quite common actually in the United States outlawing interracial marriage. So there's a really key breakdown of the system. And then the book ends actually with a number of important Supreme Court cases that build on Brown to say, you know, it's not enough just to desegregate a school, to send a couple of Black kids into an all-white school. You actually need to integrate them. And that triggered a huge conflict in the United States that I argue kind of brought this part of the civil rights movement to an end.
And how about in the North, there is the topic of redlining, where you want to keep Blacks,
Yeah.
you know, you want to accept Blacks, but as long as they don't come into your neighborhoods.
Exactly.
Can you explain how that happened?
Yeah, that is really one of the critical stories of the entire book, that in the course of the 20th century, as that migration happened, as African Americans moved up to the cities like Chicago or Detroit, which is where I'm from, or New York or Boston, that the real estate marketplace, the realtors, the mortgage lenders, and then the federal government put in a system in place that essentially solidified neighborhood segregation. And we think the way that we think about it is this term redlining. So that's only one piece of this big system, but it's a good shorthand for it. And what it did is it created hyper segregated cities so that the vast majority of African Americans were locked into a handful of neighborhoods. And when that happened, then all sorts of other discrimination followed that. That's where policing becomes more unequal, where social services become more unequal, where healthcare becomes more unequal. And that's the system that activists tried to confront in the United States in the 60s in the North. And they can't break that system. That system is still in place. And that's part of the story of the 60s. It is about this breakthrough. No one's riding in the back of a bus unless they want to ride in the back of a bus anymore. And it's about the ways in which race didn't break in the 1960s.
I heard that even today, when real estate agents are showing or talking about a particular neighborhood, of course, they use code words like, this is a safe neighborhood. That means it's mostly white neighborhood.
Yes.
Or this.
Yeah, absolutely. These things, and a lot of the things that happened, that the practices that were in place in the 1960s, like realtors steering African Americans away from white neighborhoods, that's illegal now in the United States, but it still happens all the time.
Right, it happens in a covert way, but it does still happen. Okay, so then let's move to the sexual liberation or sexuality. And the only knowledge that I have of this time period and sexuality is that I used to steal my uncle's Playboy magazine from his bottom drawer. So, but I know there was a lot more going on that the magazine Playboy. So what was happening at that time period?
So what I try to trace in the book are kind of two connected things. One is there is a dramatic transformation in birth control in the United States. The birth control pill becomes widely available in the United States in the early 1960s. And what that obviously does is it alters people's practices of sexuality. But the big change that I kind of lay on top of that is that up until the 1960s, the government had a very strong role in regulating what was allowable and what wasn't allowable in sexual terms. And so, for instance, there were states, well, one state in particular, that outlawed the sale and distribution and use of birth control in the
Mm.
United States. That was the law in Connecticut in the early 1960s. LGBTQ people faced intense discrimination as long the minute they were outed. And
As they are today, still.
yeah, but to a level that you couldn't hold on to a job. You
Mm.
had a really huge risk of being fired the minute you were outed, for whatever reason, and or however that might have happened. And what I'm trying to say is that in the course of the 60s, the government's ability to do that sort of regulation, to restrict people's private lives in these really basic ways, kind of gets shattered apart.
Mm.
And we now live in a world where we're still arguing about this in really, I mean, in major ways in the United States, right? Because most dramatic example, and it's one of the things that also ends the book, is the legalization of abortion in the United States, which happens as a consequence of these changes in Roe v. Wade. Well, we're still arguing about that in a really profound way. Gay rights is a little trickier because it's in the 60s that starts to begin as a movement. It doesn't come to full fruition in the 1960s, but the world that we live in now certainly has deep problems of discrimination, but it is way more open on questions of LGBTQ rights than it was in the 1960s. It would have been unimaginable that gay marriage would have existed in the United States in the 1960s. What happens, though, in our day, is that opening is created in the 60s and then kind of broadens out in the decades that follow. So really, that world of the early that existed, say, in 1960, is just broken open on questions of sexuality
Uh,
and the ability for the government to tell you what to do.
and that's because the government is guided by the Puritans' moral code, or
It's a great question. It's a combination of this traditional, well, it is a traditional moral code that is deeply rooted in kind of that puritanical tradition, but it's also really rooted in the power of the Catholic Church in the United States, not as a formal political organization, obviously, but that its kind of cultural standards had a really strong influence in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. And that's where a lot of the flashpoints came, is in that world. So it is definitely a long tradition in the United States, puritanical, the kind of Protestant tradition, but it is also the ways that overlaps with kind of a Catholic traditionalism too.
wow, okay, well, a lot of going on with sexuality. And then the final point is the militarism, or
Yeah.
what Eisenhower called the military complex,
Yes.
overpowering, I don't know, Wall Street and society in general.
Yeah, it is amazing the size and power of that military industrial complex. And I love that you bring up Dwight Eisenhower because you say the phrase military industrial complex and somehow it sounds very radical. It sounds very left wing. Well, it was a Republican president who had been a general who identified the problem that to a large extent, to a dramatic extent, the American prosperity was based on the ability of this massive infusion of money into the military. And that's what Eisenhower was warning about when he brought up that term, that this was a dangerous combination. And what Eisenhower tried so hard to do in the course of his presidency is to keep the US out of actually engaging in war because he knew Americans hated that. They don't hate war necessarily, but they hate our long, complicated wars. And he was afraid of that. Well, that's exactly what happened in the 1960s. The United States became stepped into a long, complicated, brutal war in Vietnam. And when that happened, it raised all of these tensions that Americans have, the ambiguous feelings Americans have about military use. And it unleashed all sorts of economic changes that really transformed the country too. And so the war is Vietnam is sort of a Pandora's box for the United States. This is what Dwight Eisenhower was trying to avoid. And in the 60s, it gets opened. And when that Pandora's box is opened, then all of a sudden, all sorts of dynamics start to play in American society that we're still dealing with. Think of this past summer in the United States with the US with final withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's a Vietnam story.
Right, right.
The
Repeat it.
same dynamic as Vietnam. And here we are all these years later experiencing exactly that politics still.
Well, after World War II, the American soldiers were the big heroes that saved the European powers. But after the Vietnam War, they became, I don't know, there was this anti-war sentiment, and the the waste of life for an ideology that it didn't make sense to most Americans.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the interesting things for me, maybe this is my historian mind racing, is that hostility to Vietnam was certainly came from a left-wing perspective. It also came from a right-wing perspective. There was a conservative anti-war sentiment in the United States that was very strong. And that conservative sentiment we've kind of ignored when we talk about Vietnam. But in fact, it was very powerful, and we see echoes of that still. It's the same sentiment that runs, the similar sentiment, I should say, that runs through the Make America Great Again movement. That why are we dealing with these foreign countries? Why do we care about them? Let's think about ourselves. Let's stop sending our boys abroad to die in causes we don't get. Or if we have to do it, then you hit the enemy with massive power and get it over with.
Wow.
In the 1960s, at the height of the Vietnam War, 20% of Americans thought that the United States should use nuclear weapons on Vietnam. So they weren't looking for less war, they were just looking for a faster one. That sentiment still exists in the United States as really strongly, but it's a part of the 60s we've completely lost.
Wow. Just staying in this subject a little bit longer, and of course, you are not into current politics, but do you think the lobbying groups still have a little bit too much of a power when the government is trying to decide whether to intervene or not to intervene in a particular region of the world where there is conflict and upheaval?
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I don't have any inside information, so I can speak as a vaguely informed citizen. But yes, I do. I think that we have and it's been in place now for so many decades, we have fused together private corporate power and military power in a way that they just cannot be separated. And it certainly feeds over to places like universities where I work as well. There's a lot of defense dollars that pour through American universities. And that's that complex that Eisenhower was talking about that was never deconstructed despite the force of anti-war sentiment in the 1960s.
Okay, is there a question that maybe I think the subject is so vast, the 60s, and there was so much change, and I'm afraid that I neglect to ask you the one important question that you wanted to share, that you wanted to be asked. So is there anything that you wanted to bring up that I didn't ask you about?
No, in fact, what I would really like to say is that I am really, really impressed that you did hit really important themes. I think that's really impressive that you were able to do that in this time frame. So
wow. Well, thank you so much.
It's really great.
Can you tell us one more time then the title of the book and where can the listeners follow your work?
The title of the book is The Shattering, America in the 1960s. And if anyone would like to stop by my website, it is Kevin Boyle History, all one word, kevinboylehistory.com.
Kevin, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this. This was really fantastic.